Hi, Holly and Matt.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so I want to start with an image that you posted about your exhibit at Serpentine Gallery in London. And it says, "All media is training data," which is also the title of a book of commissioned essays and interviews that you just put out. Can you elaborate on what this means, why you posted it?
Would you like to take that?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, we started working on a record in like 2017. Came out 2 years later called Proto, and we spent a lot of time around that period thinking about training data. So basically, when you first start training an AI model, you're left with a couple of choices, particularly back then, like very few choices. Chief among those choices is, what data do you train on? So around about that time, we were like, okay, this is going to be a really big deal, because you're left with this choice of being like, okay, well, do we train on our own data? Do we train on someone else's? Do we just rip a bunch of stuff from the web? What became clear in that time, and we started using this turn of phrase, is that it's worthwhile for people to digest that all media gestures they make are henceforth, they kind of take on this new dimension, which is training data, right? And so actually that statement, all media is training data, is rather neutral. Yeah. We've seen it's kind of controversial with some people, because I think some people interpret it as us saying all media is training data, which is everyone's fear, right? Which is like, what we do doesn't matter, and and its only function is to feed the machines, which I don't think we'd advocate for, but rather to say, once we digest that media has taken on this new dimension of training machines, it then begs the question, it brings up all kinds of questions, right? Like, okay, well, how do we value that? What's the value of that? What kind of new tools do we make to explore that? Yeah, so it's a fairly neutral statement. I also realized the other day it could be read in kind of a funny way as all of the media is training data.
That's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, which is kind of funny in like election season or something like that. But I don't dismiss that, but that wasn't the intention. It's rather just saying that like people need to digest that we do live in a kind of post-AI model world now, and everything you do will also take on this other life going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I think, a lot of people that play with AI or play with models now are using these large models that have been trained by scraping the internet. So when Matt and I first started, none of those were available, so we were making our own models, and it became really clear that the training data was really important. And we had this kind of like, it's a really obvious point. It was like this aha moment of like, as soon as something is captured in media, like recorded in a microphone or a photograph or a video, it can then go on to have this life beyond itself, become part of a training canon, can become the seed for infinite media. And that just felt like a really profound new kind of shift. It's fundamentally different from sampling or from the kind of remixing culture that we know before. It has a new kind of generative aspect to it that we feel like is kind of fundamentally new. And so the all media is training data is trying to kind of touch on that everything that we put out into the world, all of these little bits of media, they kind of comprise this, I guess, digital footprint that we're leaving behind that can kind of go on to train an unseen algorithm or an unseen model that we may never even interact with.
You've been at the vanguard of this field for a long time, and you have now started putting a foot into the art world. So you did something at the Whitney Biennale and now at the Serpentine. So I guess my first question is, why have you chosen to present your work more overtly as art in a gallery context, and to talk about this issue within that space?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I mean, I think Matt and I have never, I don't want to speak for you, but we never really saw ourselves as belonging to just one specific category. We were just making work, and then there were just kind of certain industrial realities where, we were making albums and we were, performing, and so we were kind of not by accident, but just we were in the music industry, but that wasn't necessarily like a deliberate choice, like we only want to be part of this one specific industry. So some of it was just kind of the practicality of COVID happening. All tours were canceled, and so we started kind of engaging in different ways of releasing work online and thinking about a longer format like an exhibition. We also had a baby, so touring.
Congratulations!
Thank you. So touring then wasn't quite as appealing, but if you look at the contents of the Serpentine show, it's not rehashing, but it's building on a lot of the work that we were doing around proto. Like some of those ideas are kind of continued in that show. We've just found a kind of new format to share that, and it was also just really welcome to have a new challenge. Like, what does it mean to explore these topics in this specific format? Because it's fundamentally a different format than releasing a record and performing shows.
Yeah, I think that's the same. I take the position that it's kind of weird, and a lot of this is the product of an academic infrastructure that hasn't really updated. But if you were to jump back to like 1985 or something, it would make a lot of sense for people to really define themselves as being, I'm going to film school to participate in the film and television industry. Or intuitively now, at least in the time we've been working, these things, the line that separates them is really, really fine. And we still define ourselves by these 20th century industrial categories, but they're really a bit silly, right? It's like there are musicians who are bigger musicians, but you categorize them more maybe by their identity profile or by the pictures that they take of themselves or something, right? It's like post-internet, post-social media, these things all smashed together. And so, yeah, for us, the peculiar thing was we were always kind of doing really large, expansive art projects, however you want to classify them. Like if you go back to Platform over a decade ago, it's like we were building new tools. We built a protocol for developing media. We did whatever, but those were always kind of like footnotes in the music publicity engine where people were primarily concerned about a physical disc, like an album. But we were always doing it. As Holly said, it just so happened that I mean, the funny thing is there's loads of people who participate in the contemporary art world who had bands. We just so happened to have quite a successful band. So do you know what I mean? So then people are like, oh, well, you're the musicians. It's like, yeah, well, we are musicians. I mean, look, we've been touring since we were teenagers, both of us in various different capacities. But like, we were also doing all this weird digital art stuff. And as Holly pointed out, it just so happened that because I think we treated the albums as these kind of more expansive projects. It turns out that a lot of the stuff we were interested in, much later became something that people were really interested in the art world, And so if you go back over the last 10 years, which is really what the book is, the book's kind of, with the exception of the essays contributed, it's kind of a retrospective of the work we've done over 10 years. It turns out we've done a lot of, I'd argue somewhat interesting work in these fields. Yeah. So that's the thing is I don't think either of us have ever considered ourselves primarily one thing or the other. It's just circumstance and good fortune or whatever put you in different situations.
So let's talk about the call then. So this is the exhibit that's on now at is it Serpentine? I've been saying Serpentine.
I think it's Serpentine. So it's not the Serpentine. It's just Serpentine. Because I always say the Serpentine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's on now at Serpentine through February. Can you tell me about the conceit of this project?
Oh, this project was crazy. It's so hard to encapsulate in just a few short sentences, but it's really kind of a process-oriented exhibition that we're trying to invite the visitor to experience the full process of creating a machine learning model. So a lot of AI exhibitions focus on the output, like, oh, look at this kind of crazy cool stuff that these machines can do. And that stuff is really cool, I agree. But we wanted to kind of share the beauty of the process and how there are all of these little moments along the way for artistic intervention, that it's not this fully automated thing, that like each phase in the process, there are places for artistic decisions and creativity. So from the very beginning, we decided to create a an AI choral voice. And so, we've been working with choirs for a long time, but we feel like it's a really nice metaphor for how you can kind of express how something can be greater than the sum of its parts. So taking that metaphor forward, we started at the very beginning and we decided, okay, we're going to make our own training data. We made a songbook where we wrote songs that if the choir would sing, we would have all of the information necessary to create a model of that choir's voice. And so then we took that songbook on tour across the UK. And we also brought in all of the choirs into a data trust where they could co-own and work out through working groups how they wanted to deal with their data moving forward. That was a really big kind of important part of this. It might seem a little bit bureaucratic, but was a really a kind of important experiment that we were working with. And so then when you come to the show, we wanted to share the feeling of what the tour was like, so you can experience what the training ceremonies were like in one of the rooms. You can also interact with the models that were created using all of the training data by singing through the models. There's an interactive singing room. And then we also made new music using all of the data in a custom model that can kind of create infinite, fully coherent choral songs. So we combined all of the data that we recorded across the UK with our entire back catalog of stems and outtakes and everything into one giant pot and turned that into a model that can write kind of infinite songs. And then we also made a kind of crazy GPU fan organ to play the songs from the songbook when the visitor first walks in. So we always would talk about the sound of our studio being the sound of whirring fans, because when you're working with machine learning, there's always a fan that's cooling your computer because it's just like number crunching all day. So we wanted to bring the sound of machine learning into the gallery space with this fan organ. Andrew Morley Roberts is this amazing fabricator, instrument builder that we worked with on the fan organ, and he helped us to figure out how to control each fan speed with microcontrollers so that it can acoustically play MIDI notes and music. Yeah, so like the speed of the fan spinning makes the actual pitch like an oscillator, and so you can actually attach a keyboard to the fan organ and like play, Mary Had a Limb or whatever you wanted, but it's playing music from the songbook that we wrote for the show.
Every project we do is an insane rabbit hole. So actually explaining it might have it come across as more, what's the word, didactic or kind of like nerdy than it is when you're in there. The whole thing is kind of designed to be a really pleasant exhibition to enjoy. And as Holly pointed out, the point is that, there's so much guff written about AI models, largely, I think, due to kind of misunderstanding how they work or what they are, or kind of these inherited fetishes of automation and so on and so forth. Like, we're really trying to make the point that actually training your own model is a medium for art. As Holly said, that every step of the process, you can make deliberate, opinionated decisions that ultimately will then be reflected in the model itself. And that's like a longer principle we talked about. I mean, as Holly mentioned, we touched on a lot of this in Proto. A lot of it kind of like went by the wayside. But yeah, we're thinking about, I mean, we use this term protocol art, right? Where you're like, okay. And so, yeah, so between the Whitney and Serpentine and future things that we're working on at the moment, we're very much zeroed in on being like, how much can you get out of making a model? Like how, that's our main focus.
Yeah, just to reiterate, it was a complicated process, and it is, but our goal was to try to find a beautiful way to make AI, and that also kind of, that's why we went into the data trust kind of issue, because we wanted it to be really fair for everyone, but we also wanted the exhibition to feel like a really beautiful meditative moment. So you don't actually have to understand what's happening technically. You can just go in and experience something really beautiful that was created through this process.
Yeah, I guess for maybe people who haven't visited it yet, it is very aesthetic. Like, you had some beautiful pieces actually designed specifically for the exhibit.
Yeah, so it's like a fully immersive, almost kind of chapel-like experience when you go in there. We worked with D&B on the soundscape audio, so there's speakers everywhere. And if you haven't been to the Serpentine before, it's a really unusual space. It was previously used for gunpowder storage, I think prior to or in World War I. Not sure about the timeline. So it has this really interesting architecture where it's like a hallway and then two little chapels in the middle. So we kind of used each space to represent a different part of the creation of a model process, and each one has its own kind of sound universe. And then we created these beautiful objects in collaboration with Sub, which is a really awesome design team here in Berlin, actually. That was really fun working with them. And together we came up with these very ornate and chapel-like objects that represent the protocol and the process and hopefully bring people a little bit into this world.
Well, that was actually going to be a question to you. When I think of your work, you're doing a lot of really experimental, uncanny things with AI. You're really harnessing its potential in a way that I feel that maybe most people don't have the wherewithal or the ability to engage with AI in that way. And then the results I feel is kind of a flattening of art. I just think of filters that get put on a picture on Instagram, or I want my track to sound like this, and then it's kind of spits out almost like the lowest common denominator. So
everything's a bit mid.
Everything's a bit mid. So how do you think we get past that, the average art maker?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why everything is a bit mid is that everyone's using the same data sets. Everyone's using these large models that are trained on the open internet. So instead of making a bespoke training set where you're making data specifically for an outcome that an artistic outcome that you're looking for, you're kind of just it's almost like using a preset for everything when you can really make your own thing. And that's why from the beginning, those tools honestly weren't even available to us at the beginning, so we had to start with our own training sets, but I'm so glad that we did, because that taught us, what you put into the model is what you get out of the model. And so if you're using something that's really general purpose, if you're using a large image model it's trained on, millions and millions of images of bottles, it's going to have something that looks kind of like a bottle that holds water, but it might not understand your kind of personal subjective relationship to bottles that your grandmother smashed when you were 2 years old, and it needs to have this particular patina and all this. That's where kind of artistic interpretation and subjectivity comes in, and then you have to actually put that into the model yourself.
Yeah, I also think as well it's only really a matter of time. The challenge is this is our area of interest, and we are really dogged in pursuing it. And part of that's a pride thing. Part of it's just that's kind of our practice. Personally, I feel a sense of we've done this for a decade. Anytime we want to understand an issue, I want to understand it well enough to sit in a room with the world's expert on that issue and be able to have a debate. That's just a point of personal principle. I don't expect everybody to care that much about training data. It's a bit manic, and it's really not pleasant. Honestly, it's not but we take that side of the practice really seriously, where it's if we're gonna say something and we're gonna do something, we might be wrong. We might be missing something. But ultimately, I want to really stand behind what we do. That being said, the ability to customize this stuff is around the corner. For most people, a lot of these general purpose models, I get it, right? Training your own models as we do, I do think has its own particular valence to it, but a lot of these general purpose models are amazing. They are, and that's why people use them, right? The point is this ability to customize and kind of add more authorship to a model output, I think is only really a matter of time. And it's just by dint of us being really, really deep in the weeds on this, we're going to be a couple of years ahead of consumer, for example, the model on the perimeter Serpentine is better than anything you'll hear on the internet. Genuinely. It's like a multi-channel diffusion model, where the voices are harmonizing with each other. It's you might not be able to tell, because it just sounds like a bunch of voices, but it's on the research side of things, we really take it. We really try to push it, and we have a lot of help as well in doing so. But I think, over time, artists just generally are going to be more interested in making the tools their own, right? You can just use a really sick synth preset in Ableton, right? That's great. And then you have the modular world, and it's those exact people remind me a lot of actually all the kind of like AI art nerds on Reddit who like, there's a new IP adapter and they're figuring out how to tweak the color space to make it a little bit. And it's like, it's very analogous. And those people exist, and there's a huge community of people who, you know, beyond any of these questions about consent and rights, which I think are legitimate, but I tend to, personally, I don't really take a moral stance on this. I just think, you know, there's a way for lots of people to be happy at the same time. But beyond all that, there is just like a massive community of people now who are really, really interested in how this stuff works and doing kind of remarkable things. And so, not dissimilar in a way actually to the whole crypto conversation, which, you know, is still a dirty word in some corners, but it's like, from my perspective, in the last 10 years, the greatest amount of creative energy and kind of novel tinkering has been happening in these odd technical spaces, at least that complement my personal interest. I'm like, this reminds me of weird communities that I used to be a part of in music or art or whatever. There's a lot of energy around this stuff, but you're not going to see that, you know, that's hard to infer when your only engagement is like playing with ChatGPT, which is amazing, you know, but there's a whole other world. Yeah.
I also think sometimes we can confuse the media with the art. Art is a really complex kind of web of discourse between different actors that are all kind of interested in this topic. And it's not always just baked into that small piece of media. So I think that it's important that we not kind of confuse those two things. Art is essentially meaning making. It's how we as humans kind of interpret something as a gesture that's very much part of the kind of time when it happens and the context around it.
So I was doing some reading up on just where you come from, because you're doing this kind of like this advocacy work now, and you both come from like pretty grassroots DIY scene. Can you tell me how you met originally?
Oh, hell yeah.
Well, since we're on a podcast, we met because of a podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I was working at a music startup that was doing, it was like a music data bank where you could choose music for various
Nothing changes apparently.
various productions. And so I would always listen to this podcast. What was it called? It was a podcast that Southern Records would put out, and Southern Records was a distribution company, and they represented a ton of indie labels. And so once a month, they would put out a podcast where they would feature different tracks that would be on different releases that they had coming down the line. And I was like a religious listener to this podcast, and it would come out like on around the same date every month. And then it was late by like a week or something, and I'm crazy. And so I wrote the info at and was like, your podcast is late.
I'm waiting.
I'm waiting. How long ago? This is like 18 years ago or something. Like, this is not when podcasts were mainstream.
Like Winamp era.
Yeah. And so that info at landed in Matt's inbox, and we just started chatting. And yeah, long story short, he brought me a custom podcast, and the rest is history.
Yeah, that's true. All of that's yeah. I was working at Southern Records, which, for those who don't know, it's people in actually dance music circles might be more familiar with SRD, because SRD was like the major distributor. I don't know if it is anymore, but the major distributor of vinyl in London. And I was young. I was like 18 or something. So basically my first job was working at this label, Southern. Southern's really interesting. It was started by this guy, John Loder, who was kind of like the unofficial member of Crass. He was basically like the business mind behind it. Okay. This like crazy guy. Like, what people don't know about Loder, which is wild, is that he's kind of not well credited, but should be credited as being kind of the progenitor of like the indie label ecosystem, period. Like when he died, Ian Mackay of Discord Records was like, we wouldn't have been a thing if it weren't for John Loder. Like, he was like a guy that figured it out, you know. It was really smart. I believe computer scientist as well. So anyway, yeah, I was working there, and I was like the dog's body, so they would send me all the dodgy, like the random emails from random people. Yeah, anyway, so no, I saw Harlan and I saw Berlin, and I'd been to Berlin a few times prior to that, so I was like, oh, interesting, like cool, like yeah, so I brought her a CD. We still have.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and what's wild about that is we met, and 2 weeks later we were living together, and we got married a year later, and we've been together. Yeah, so we've been like basically.
We were all in.
We were like all in from like the first, which was
amazing.
Yeah, so but weirdly a podcast indie. Yeah, but at the time we were both very active in music, but like a different era of music. Where like I was really into metal and hardcore. That was like my whole universe, and you were like doing weird noise music and like
Techno.
Yeah, just odd. Yeah, there's fortunately a lot of those links have been excised by the internet. This is yes, pre blockchains. This stuff just kind of died, and that's not terrible. But we met largely through music.
Okay, and you had a live project, right? It was called Body. You performed.
Oh yeah, but that was way later.
Okay.
That was way yeah, that was a San Francisco thing. Oh yeah, we had tons of bands.
We started a band called Total Accomplishment because we wanted to go out dancing, and there weren't that many like live bands playing dance music, and so we started this band for that sole purpose. And then we would play warehouses in Oakland, and it was really fun. We would just go dance and play, and then we started Body so that when we were traveling around, we could just play just the two of us, because Total Accomplishment was with another friend of ours.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think like it's odd. It's odd because I think in our case, more people came to know of us by the time Holly released solo records, and then maybe me because I like am into nerdy stuff or whatever. But then there's this whole prehistory of like people don't know, like we were just touring, making music for the longest time, and it was cool. I mean, it was like a whole other world. Yeah.
We never recorded anything with those bands though, because it wasn't about that. It wasn't. We never had this idea of like, oh yeah, let's release records and try to make a career out of this. We were like, no, we just want to play parties. And so the first time we actually recorded was when I was working on my solo album, and then we were like, okay, let's actually do this for real.
You did some programming at Gray Area, which is a cultural organization, and you curated talks and performances. And my understanding is that you tried to get tech people in the same room as young artists who felt like they were being displaced. And I am curious, I mean, what was the goal of doing this? And do you feel like what you're doing now is in some way an extension of that work?
Well, this is the funny thing in a way, is literally everything we do is us repeating ourselves for the past 20 years. No word of a lie. Like, you're like, oh yeah, we met through a podcast, and I was working for a computer scientist who was really into DIY culture. It's like literally everything we do is the same. We were in the Bay Area at the time, and I was working at Gray Area, which is still there. You know, it's one of the longest standing kind of like art and technology institutions in San Francisco. And yeah, I mean, the context there is, you know, people might be familiar with the Techlash now, which is its own like category of media, right? Like you can open any media site now, and there's someone whose beat is to just kind of like say, you know, be mad at Facebook or whatever, right? That wasn't the case before. A lot of that culture started in San Francisco. There was kind of a period of time, for various reasons, some of which very legitimate, where there was a huge cultural change in San Francisco.
I'm from San Francisco.
There we go. Hey, okay, cool.
I'm familiar.
All right. So, and but it was a very sensitive period of time where it's like all of a sudden you had all these kind of like long-standing art cultures, and then people like, oh, we're going to move to LA. It's getting too expensive. Everyone here works at Facebook. What's going on? Airbnb? What's this?
This was the beginning of the Google bus thing too, where...
Exactly. And so that tension was coming out a little bit. And it's funny. I mean, like, you know, there are many signals across the world, but like San Francisco is pretty special in the sense that like if something becomes a really big deal in San Francisco, it will echo elsewhere. And you can, I have many examples of this, but it's quite a small place, as you know, right? And so at the time we were like very torn because our social circles have always been somewhere in the middle. You know, we're kind of interested in this tech stuff, had a lot of friends who were working in that world, who were all lovely, who were all going to parties with us, and also come from a more DIY music background that had nothing to do with that, right? And so we're like, okay, this is kind of strange. Maybe we should actually like start convening these meetings where we can actually, you know, dispel some of the coarse stereotypes. You know, like people don't, I mean, one of the first meetings we did, there's one of the founding engineers at Facebook who's also a DJ and like is a lovely guy who like, you know, has since like, I mean, he started a club and did lots of lovely stuff. And you're like, okay, you know, why don't we just bring everyone in a room together and like work it out? Because sure, you know, everything will go fine. And in some cases it did. In other cases it became a bit of a mudslinging kind of fruit throwing exercise. But it's still kind of worthwhile. And I mean, and again, we just end up repeating ourselves that like, by dint of our interests, we do fall somewhere square in the middle of this stuff, and are maybe sympathetic to both sides of the argument, but I mean, just generally, I think everyone's kind of had a really hard time reconciling the presence of tech and particularly tech companies in our lives. And I personally, not speaking for Holly, take the position that you got to kind of run into the fire a little bit, that it's not sufficient to pretend it's not happening, right? And pretend like it's 1995 or something like this, which it's not, and it never will be again. Rather to try and eke out and find commonalities between worlds. Yeah, but yeah, it's very much still what we do. But I mean, that's, as I say, it's no surprise, because it's kind of who we are. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think we were also coming to the city where the city had this legacy from the 90s where you had a lot of like genuine freaks interested in technology, and there was a lot of intersection between arts and technology with like rave culture and all this kind of stuff there. And then so that was the kind of legacy of the city, and then it was kind of shaping into this new thing where there was, you're starting to see the kind of like cartoon of the tech bro or whatever, and you had the Google bus and people would be like throwing stuff at the Google bus. And it was very strange to us because we had this affinity for the kind of weird tech, tinkerers who were kind of, at the rave or whatever. And so for us to see this kind of like separation, we felt like was a shame. Like it didn't have to be like that. So we wanted to bring, we were like really idealistic. We're like, we could just get everyone to talk to each other. Everything would be fine. And like, of course not. There were some hilarious town halls that we organized where people were just like yelling at each other. And we were like, oh my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? But I still think it's a worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it's funny because all those archetypes, like, again, the kind of 20th century archetypes of like, you had the wired freaks or whatever, like the Whole Earth catalog kind of like Bay Area culture of like utter freaks who still exist and are very much more like, I am a fan. And then over time, like the tech industry became a bit more normie, right? Like it became just kind of like a good choice for a middle-class person to go into, right? It came like banking or something like this. But what I always found kind of funny is it's easy to kind of dunk on tech people, but the funny comparison is, in a way, that's kind of what happened with art too, right? It's like there was this period of time where it's like all these archetypes that we bask in now were defined by people who made irrational decisions to do some wild thing that no one had done before, and there was no money in it, and now they're like king of the world because they established this thing, right? And art school became like another thing that good middle class people did, right? And it's like you go to art school and you're like, yeah, sure, I'm going to read the books about what everyone did before, and it's like I don't think it's controversial to suggest that it's a little bit less of a risky life choice to become a DJ now than it was in 1996 or something like that. It's like so in a way, all these kind of freak cultures, it's easy to poke fun at tech people, but like we should absorb some of the critique ourselves. It's like all these kind of cultures that we fetishize from a period of time have become kind of normalized, right? And then the interesting part, which is more where my loyalty lies, is there are still freaks out there. But they're just kind of like legit freaks. like they're not easy to place anywhere, and they might exist some in the arts or some in tech or some in whatever. But to me, like if you want to kind of like try and find the spirit of these things, it's never easy. You always find yourself in like an odd space where you might disagree with some people, but where people are taking risks and doing things you don't quite have a name for yet. And that's where techno came from, or dance music culture came from. Does it happen now in clubs? Up for debate. But this is also why it could be confused that like we have alliances with tech. No, we could be confused that we have alliances with art. No, I personally have alliances with that spirit. And you find that in strange places, and I'm not willing. And you find it just as equally in tech as you do in art, and in God knows what other spaces I don't end up in. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. You, Matt, came on the RA Exchange about not quite a decade ago. I mean, it was like 8 years ago. 8 years ago.
Crazy.
And you posed some questions. You said, "How do we deal with new structures of power? How do we understand our position in relation to these structures? And what does it mean to be independent in this context?" And you were specifically talking about streaming platforms and major labels. Do you feel like your answers to these questions have become any clearer in the intervening years?
No, I mean, So like I was against streaming quite vocally. You were against streaming longer than I was. It took me a while to come around to you, so give Holly credit on this. She was right, and then I caught up. What I was mostly interested in at the time, God, this is a long time ago, is just one kind of critiquing this idea of independence just generally, of saying, well, from my understanding, when you isolate the idea of independence and you fetishize just that part, in a way, at least with the Web 2 economy, we've been spoiled with independence, right? Everyone is so independent that they get to be this isolated actor, with their laptop and their sound card and shouting out into the void, right? And you're like, well, actually, when you're just given pure grade independence, it's not that fun, right? Like, it's another word for isolation, right? But actually, tech companies at the time love this idea of independence because it's still now. I mean, it's still like this line that's kind of peddled, and you're like, well, they enjoy kind of basking in the glow of the cool of independent music of the late 20th century, right? And it's like, well, yes, but actually from my engagement with it and our long engagement with it, right? Like, we put out records with 4AD and Revenge, and I worked at Southern, which is like one of the prototypes for this stuff, it was actually the interdependence of those networks that made them special, which is coded a little more communitarian, I will concede, but it's kind of the truth, right? Is that the longer you've been in any of these industries working, you understand that we don't exist without you, right? You don't exist without us or Eli. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's like, actually independent, but independent networks are actually a weird conspiracy, and it's a miracle that they ever existed. And they were a conspiracy of different actors. And over time, when you look back, it's really easy to take just the kind of hits and be like, oh, well, like Kurt Cobain was an independent spirit. And you're like, well, doesn't exist without Sub Pop, doesn't exist without Seattle, doesn't exist without whatever. And so you can have all the independence you like, but you're not going to get the same outcomes if you don't have the interdependent structures underneath them, right? Do I think this point has... it's funny, I saw Sonny Skrillex came to this conclusion yesterday. I was tweeting about it, and I was like, yeah, it's true. He's a great guy, by the way. But like, no, he is genuinely lovely guy. He was just like, yeah, it's kind of weird that it's kind of weird to even call what I do independent when I depend so much on my collaborators and my team and so. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. He's a clever guy. But so anyway, so in those intervening years, has that like interdependence idea kind of worked? No. Do I think there's kind of more ammo to suggest that it was a correct thesis? Yes. If anything, but part of my motivation at the time was like, okay, actually, to Holly's point, decentralized networks are a way to kind of build those things from the ground up again. I was particularly excited about Ethereum. Did that work out? Yes, it's a major significant thing that you can invest your pension in now. At the time, I was interested in kind of allegiance networks of saying, okay, well, what if we defected from Spotify to create this other alternative that could be whatever? I mean, it's amusing to me that, this is the week of defection from Twitter to Blue Sky, which is an alternate belief network, which is very left-coded, progressive coded, whatever. People sick of Twitter, they're going to Blue Sky. Funnily enough, also funded by crypto, which nobody talks about. This is mostly the anti-crypto people who are going, but still, I think that's good, right? So this idea of saying that, we'll just have different networks that are characterized by different belief structures has kind of happened, but quietly. And regrettably also, I would argue that in that period of time, you've seen a bit of a decline of the press more broadly and its kind of influence in the world. So these things are happening, but there's no kind of central point of authority anymore, or very dwindling central points of authority anymore to be like, yeah, that happened. So now it's just kind of happening. I hope that answered the question.
Oh, totally.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think I was wrong. I'm not particularly happy about it, but I wasn't particularly happy about it then. Yeah. So.
So what are you two working on now? What do you think are going to be like the next big projects for you in this lifelong venture?
This is actually what we're figuring out right now. It's like this, like it's after birthing a baby, which is this exhibition. It's like you have to kind of like take a moment, take a beat and be like, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what did I enjoy, what would I change? And so we're kind of going through this moment of trying to figure out what we want the next couple of years to look like. But speaking personally, I really enjoyed the exhibition format. Speaking to this idea of interdependence, it's so clear when you're making an exhibition how many people are part of that process. Like, it's totally not possible to do that by yourself. You have fabricators, you have installers, you have visitor services, it's just like this huge hulking thing. And that actually was really fun. I think I have learned that I really like working in big teams and I like collaborating and opening up the practice in this way. I've spent many, many hours alone in the studio. And back in 2017, when we started working on Proto, one of the reasons why we put together an ensemble was because I was just lonely in the studio. I was like, I don't want to sit in the studio for hours and hours. And of course, I ended up sitting in the studio alone for hours and hours, editing all of the recordings that we did of the choirs. But still, I've kind of learned that about myself, that I really like working with other people. So I think we'll pursue some of these kind of like exhibition and larger format ways of showing our work in the future, because it's fun.
Do you feel like genuinely do you continue to be excited by doing this work? Or, you two have really become authorities. Like you're really at the vanguard of this. Like, do you feel more of like a responsibility to continue doing what you're doing?
That's very kind. Thank you.
You sound like a Barry White boy.
It's very kind. Without sounding like a saint or something, I think we've always felt that a little bit. Not that we're great, more that we have a responsibility, because, as I was saying before, like, generally when we say something, we mean it. And it's partly a point of personal pride, but also just like, what are you doing if you haven't... I mean, for me, as part of the practice, like, I would feel weird talking... I try not to talk about things I have no idea about, which also makes it really... No, but I mean, there's a lot of temptation to do that, right? But like... I try to know a great deal, or as much as I possibly can, about the things I do care about, so that I can be useful or have something to say or an idea that's good or something. And so I've always kind of felt that a little bit. And so maybe that has contributed to us having a bit of trust on this. It's like people will disagree with this. That's totally fine. But I'd hope people believe that we believe what we're saying. Do you know what I mean? Even if we disagree, it's like, no, there's some qualification to what we're saying. It's like we're trying. Yeah, so the work is really good. I mean, we're spoiled in a way. Like, we're very fortunate to be able to pursue some of these ideas. I also think it's really nice that, like, it's taken us the best part of 20 years working to get to a point where people just kind of go with us, right? So, I mean, that's a huge gift. And it where it's like, okay, cool. Like, we have a couple of mad ideas right now that, we're explaining it to a partner yesterday, and I'm like, I don't know if you fully understand this, but you're like, but you got a decent track record, like, yeah. So I mean, so that's a huge gift. That's kind of the ideal place to be, I think, as an artist, where you're like, okay, cool, just trust me on this. Like, I'm pretty sure it's not going to blow up. Like, yeah. So I mean, that's really cool. But who knows? But I mean, everything's quite uncertain right now. I mean, that's the funny thing that I think is characterized by everyone is like, we are doing relatively well at the moment relative to other situations. I'm incredibly grateful for that. And at the same time, we're also like constantly looking at ourselves being like, 5 years, like, what are we going to... It's a very uncertain time. Do you know what I mean? And so I'm super grateful to do this and personally try to take it very, very seriously. And, like, I think I'm not sure what all this looks like in 5 or 10 years, and that's okay. I don't know if we want to elaborate on that anymore, but I think it's true.
I think with any kind of technical topic like this, there are all kinds of different timelines, and we're really fortunate to be in conversation with people who are like at a very advanced part of that timeline of the conversation, like at the very cutting edge of different kind of technological developments. And I think we actually take great pleasure in translating some of those things to our community and to friends who aren't necessarily following that as closely, because people are busy and different people follow different things. And so I don't know, it's kind of fun to be able to kind of like translate back and forth. So I do feel a kind of responsibility for that, but I also find it pleasurable.
That's the most important thing. Is there anything you're at liberty to share about what you have coming up next?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, Holly said we put out PD12M, which is currently number 2 trending data set on Hugging Face, which will mean something to about 10 people, but it's huge. Big deal. No, so currently Spawning, so our collaborators at Spawning are training public diffusion, which will be the first very performant image model trained only on public domain data. We think it's going to be about 70%, 78% as good as the state-of-the-art kind of image models. Maybe we'll see once it's trained, but like maybe once it's fine-tuned, it'll be even higher there, which we're very excited about it because in a way it's kind of like a manifestation of a thesis that's been running for years, where we're like, even back to Holly Plus, which we didn't really discuss, but it's just like, we're like, oh yeah, you can have models that someone fully owns that didn't step on anyone's toes, and they can be really, really good. They can be kind of like artworks. And we're like, okay, if we succeed in that model, then that would be great. So there's a few ideas like that with Spawning and others. There's a few kind of exhibition proposals for next year. The call from Serpentine is touring, and and of course with us being like extra, it can't just tour as it was in London. Like every show has to be slightly different because we're like so stupid. Like, so the call will tour, and then there's kind of this big open question also about music, because it's kind of weird. I mean, Holly alluded to this before, but like we got kind of screwed by the universe in a way where everyone did. You know, where like COVID hit right in the middle of that tour, and we were booked for like the biggest stage of our lives. We were like main stage Roskilde, like we were properly going for it, and then it all kind of disappeared. And so we've been lucky, very fortunate in a way that other things have picked up in that time, but then we're in this kind of weird no man's land where we're like, wait, I really enjoyed doing that. But in order to participate obviously in music, like I won't speak for you, but for me, the huge benefit of it is that you get to make a record and then you get to go show it to people. Do you know what I mean? Like just putting a record out is cool, but like playing is like the whole thing, or it is a huge part of it. And so, yeah, there's this big question of like, we should probably do that again at some point. I don't know, but like we're busy and there's lots of stuff going on and yeah, but I know we also have nuts. Yeah.
We have a huge amount of music that we made from this show. So not just the training data that, you know, we shared most of that, but the generative model can create kind of endless music. And some of the stuff that we didn't even include in the show is like really beautiful and amazing. And I would love to find a way to share that with the world. So we're trying to figure out what that is. Is that an album? Is that I don't know what that is yet. And also, as Matt mentioned, the call will tour. We think it might come to Berlin, which would be really nice. And then Philippe Perrino, who's an artist that we greatly admire, he's curated us in the Okayama Triennial in Japan this year. It has been announced.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yeah, it was announced.
Okay, cool.
Alpha right here. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. In Okayama.
Yeah, anyway, so yeah, that's some of the stuff we have coming down the line.
Yeah.
Are you ever afraid your child might rebel at one point and become like a corporate lawyer or something? That's a plan.
Someone's going to pay for this eventually.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like he's just turning 2, so it's like his personality is really just starting to emerge, and it's actually fun to just, you know, like he likes things that I find really annoying, but you just kind of go with it because you're like, actually, I want you to explore the things that, you know, he loves this guy Blippi on YouTube, and it's so annoying, and I hate Blippi, but it's like he finds Blippi amazing, so we're gonna watch Blippi.
I think that's it. Yeah, we definitely had this. Like, we've had friends who. You certainly would not say they were disappointed by their children. That's not the right framing, but more just no. That's why I said it wasn't that. I'm just trying to find another word. It's like, but just like surprised at being like, whoa, where did you come from? Like, you know, like you were really interested in very different stuff, and that's actually kind of the beauty of it, right? It's just like, I mean, yeah, I mean, we're only 2 years deep into it, but increasingly I'm like starting to understand that where like the classic wisdom is like, so long as you're happy and healthy. That's great. I'm like, yeah, I kind of get it now. Like, I have no designs other than hopefully providing as much opportunity or like comfort as possible for the child. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That's the psychedelic thing about it, though, that I'd recommend, which I feel let down by media generally because like people, my understanding of having a child before was like really dull. It was like, it was always presented as like, and I'm like, oh no, like this nature nurture thing is so complicated. It's only once you go through the process that you're like, whoa, like this person, I didn't choose how this person came out. Like this kid like has a way that sure you can teach them certain things, but there's like a thread, there's like a determination coming from somewhere in that kid, and you're like, whoa, that turned your world upside down a little bit. That's kind of cool. Yeah.
I remember when I was at Mills studying electronic music, a sound artist came through town, and Mills was kind of an unusual situation where it was an all-girls school with a co-ed grad school. So it was like a largely female class, and this female sound artist came through and she was like, one of the reasons why I'm able to have a career is because I didn't have children. And that really stuck in my head. It was like, oh, wow, can you not have a career when you have children? And then another artist that I admired is kind of famous for saying, like, you can't be a good artist and have a child because your art has to be your child. So I just kept hearing these things over and over. And I have to say to anyone listening, that is all such bullshit. Children make your life so much richer, and I feel like he's made our art better. So I would like for that narrative to shift.
No, I'm really happy you said that. I have to say that's something I've been, it's been spinning in my mind. So
not enough people talk about it. And again, just to go back to the previous point, because for some weird reason it's coded as it's been politicized. You know what I mean? Where it's like it's not. It's like it's something we do. Yeah, it's one of the things that we're here to do. Whether you choose to do it or not, it's totally your choice. But like, yeah, and I mean it's tough. It's kind of like playing life on hard mode in a little way. Like you have a bit of arrogance after you get through the first 6 months, and you're like, children, like you don't understand, like you don't understand how hard it can be, and it's kind of true, but like you definitely like get arrogant, but then afterwards you're like, actually, I do feel I would have missed out on that. That's the thing that blew my mind is like it's psychedelic. Where I'm like, I have this term herodescent, where I'm like Link, our son, will like turn his head, and as he turns his head, it's like grandma. Holly's mom, my dad lifts his head up. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, it's so insane. Do you know what I mean? And I'm like, you can hear that, and then you can experience it, and you're just like, whoa, like I am just a vessel. Like I mean, like I'm just a vessel in the continuum of life that, like, you know what I mean? Like energy just passes through me, and now you have inherited it. Like, take my money. Like, you know, like, do you know what I mean? You're like. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it becomes very real, and you're like, whoa, like the world feels very different now in a way that's very rich. And that's not like Hallmark card shit where they're like, oh, your life is so much better because you get to see the world with fresh eyes. It's like, yeah, you kind of do, but like the fresh eyes are also like existentially insane. Do you know what I mean? Like, what?
What is one thing that the average listener could do to empower themselves in terms of, like, I don't know, their relationship with data or AI? I don't know if I'm phrasing the question the right way.
The best advice I say generally is learn by doing. So, do you know about what like Gell-Mann amnesia is? Okay, is this, I forget, there was some author, it was like Michael Crichton or something came up with it and then called it Gell-Mann, which is really confusing. But the basic principle is that when you know a lot about a topic, you'll then open up a newspaper or something, and then you read what someone says about the topic, and you'll be like, wait a second, that's not right at all. And Gell-Mann amnesia is then you'll go to another section of the newspaper, and you'll look at someone writing about the economy, and you'll be like, oh, good point, yeah, I trust you. And it's like, right, so Gell-Mann amnesia is this sensation you get where you don't recognize the truth in things that you read, right? To the point earlier about kind of, what's the word, like not being skeptical or kind of ignoring things. This subject of AI is complicated. The best way to understand it is to kind of play around with models. It just so happens that models are really good at speaking to you in a language that you might understand because they answer your questions, right? I think it's definitely in everyone's interest to try and inform themselves as much as possible about how the models work, what the implications are, and I would just encourage, I think the best advice you could give to anybody is don't be easily convinced to ignore this, because at least from my vantage point, this is a really big deal, which is not a reason to scare anyone. I don't think that art's going away. I don't think that there's a lot of rubbish spoken about, as Holly said, we confuse the media for the art. Just because ChatGPT can make 1 million essays doesn't mean you want to read any of them, right? So people over-egg this stuff, but there's another turn, which is like, it's really fashionable to be like, oh, it's all rubbish, this will disappear. And I'm like, no. It actually hasn't even started, to be quite honest. And that's fine, so long as you educate yourself on where things are at your own pace, And the analogy I would make in a way is, we're old enough. I remember going to parties in California when Tumblr first hit, when Twitter first hit. And you're like, there was a whole bunch of people. I remember when selfies were controversial, right? Amongst the press, you would read thought pieces being like, this is the epitome of like narcissism. Why would someone want to take pictures of themselves? And that was like the common consensus understanding, like, this is rubbish, this crappy low class stuff. And it's like, yeah, and now, for better or worse, tell me that these media networks weren't influential in the election we just had, right? So on and so forth, right? So I would see it as analogous to that. It's like, there's no reason to like dive all in uncritically, but you should probably approach this subject in the same way that you could imagine someone approaching YouTube or Twitter or whatever 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, which is to say this is going to be a part of everyone's media diet. And so it's in your interest to know what it is, you know, it's just, so, you know, by all means, I mean, like, obviously we publish a lot on this and like try to be as neutral about it as possible to just like translate information. But, you know, but there's no real, there's no substitute for just doing it yourself.
I would just reiterate that don't be afraid to use the presets now, and then you can figure out how to go deeper later. So just dive into some of these programs and just try to understand how they work. Also, I think, you know, I'm not actually going to bring up what the topic is, but a new kind of technological thing came up the other day that Matt and I both had this kind of like immediate ick towards. And so because we had this ick towards it, we're like, okay, we want actually, instead of just having a knee-jerk ick towards this thing, we want to actually understand why other people are finding it compelling. And I think that's a really important kind of impulse. Like if you see something and you're like, immediately, what are you like? I'm not, because I don't want to mention it. It's too embarrassing.
I was just going to say, the way you described it makes it sound like it was like a laser gun or something. Where you're like, yeah, initially we had this ick toward this like extermination weapon, but we were like, you know, maybe we should think of it.
No, it's nothing that bad.
Very intrigued. You'll have to tell me after.
It's nothing that bad. But just if your knee-jerk reaction is to be dismissive or to think that something sucks, like actually, and you see other people, you know, engaging with it on a deeper level, maybe try to understand why other people are engaging with it before you just immediately dismiss it. Because I just see so many people dismissing things right away before they like fully understand what's going on.
Can I just say what it was? It seems like a bigger deal now that...
Well, you made it a bigger deal by
sorry.
focusing on it now. Like,
fine.
Is it drippy? Is it the YouTube?
Oh, Blippy, yeah. Blippy must be stopped. No, it was meme coins because meme coins because obviously like we have a deep engagement with that stuff, and there's been this passing of the baton, for better or quite likely worse, to meme coin universe. But it's so prominent that you can't ignore it, and for all the nutsness of it, it's actually been the hardest thing for me to be like, wait, okay, let's try and be rational here. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, but it's about disentangling it and being like, okay, well, this stuff is clearly really bad. But there's something fundamental there where like things often don't catch on for no reason, you know? And so I think that's just generally a good tendency. It's a good tendency to like...
I think people are judgmental really quickly.
Yeah, people are judgmental really quickly, and in times like this where I think things are changing quite quickly, and like there's bullshit on both sides, right? There's people who are like saying some ridiculous things about the capabilities of these AI models, particularly in the meme coin space, actually. Like, that's, you know, like treating them like they're autonomous and they have agency when it's like an illusion. So you know, there on both sides there are people kind of selling bullshit. But I think that's the difficult part, is that you need to kind of like, you're best served kind of being cautiously curious, because I do think that in 10 years' time we will look back and it will be pretty obvious that our media landscapes and just the general economic logic of how things work will have changed quite drastically, and that just seems uncontroversial to me in the sense that, you know, as in, we might remember when Twitter first became a thing. And, you know, that was a very limited interaction, right? Like 120 character text messages viewed publicly could have that big of an impact. I'm like, this stuff is, in the AI space, there's some just fascinating, quite really peculiar stuff that is yet to come. And it's worth people knowing that, because we've all got to live and, you know, make a living. And, you know, it's good to be informed on these things without knee-jerk dismissing them, as is the current trend, you know.
Well, Matt and Holly, thank you so much for your time and for your work. Really appreciate this conversation.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Been a real pleasure. Yeah, thank you.